The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, the Labor Party supports the 15 bills that are before the House for third reading today that derive from the Organised Crime and Anti-Corruption Legislation Bill. And of course the Labor Party would strongly support legislation that is designed to deal with offences like corruption and like organised crime. Organised crime is huge in this country. The methamphetamine market by itself is estimated to be worth $1 billion within New Zealand, money going into the pockets of organised crime and gangs. Money laundering in this country is estimated at an even higher level, $1.5 billion. We have residual problems in human trafficking. All of these problems, sir, are domestic problems, but they're also international problems. And it behoves us to cooperate with like-minded countries overseas and international organisations to suppress that sort of criminal activity. So we support it, but we don't support it without criticism of the way that the government has handled this measure. For a start, Mr Speaker, it has taken so long to get these measures outlined by the Minister, mainly measures that make a lot of sense, before this House. We should have acted years ago. Judith Collins, as Minister of Justice, stood up in 2012, 3 years ago, and said, "I will have this legislation before the House and through the House by the end of next year." Well, we know what happened there. Judith Collins herself got caught up in a scandal involving Orovida, and it didn't happen. But this bill itself represents the tardiness of the government in dealing with the problem for which we have been criticised internationally. Mr Speaker, we signed the United Nations Convention Against Corruption 11 years ago. 11 years ago. It doesn't come into effect until we legislate to bring it into effect, to do what has to be done under it, and then we can ratify it. My question to the next National Speaker is why it's taken this government 7 full years to get to the point of allowing us to ratify the United Nations Convention Against Corruption if this legislation is so important, and I believe that it is. Mr Speaker, there is a key weakness in this bill too that I want now to focus on. It was a weakness that was raised before the Select Committee by major organisations that we would respect. Transparency International, the experts in this country on measures that a country needs to take to prevent corruption, to prevent bribery. The Human Rights Commission, the Victoria University School of Government, all of them drew to the government members' attention a fatal flaw in this legislation which tries to distinguish between a bribe and a bribe on the basis of the size of the bribe. And that distinction is kept in the Crimes Act. It's section 105C3 of the Crimes Act. And it says that the foreign bribery offence does not apply if A, the act is alleged to constitute the offence was committed for the sole or primary purpose of ensuring or expediting the performance by a foreign public official of a routine government action. Mr Speaker, I'm sorry, that's what bribery is. You pay the official to carry out the action. That gives you an advantage. And secondly, the value of the benefit is small. And Amy Adams, the Minister of Justice, continued that false analogy. It's okay to make a bribe as long as it's small, she said. She said, let me quote, "It is in the usual course of activity to make payments as long as the payments are small." Well, I'm sorry, Mr Speaker, bribery is akin to pregnancy. You can't be a bit pregnant and you can't exercise a corrupt act in bribing an official and say, but it's only a bit. It's a small bit, not a large bit. That distinction is not recognised in the Convention Against Corruption, nor is it recognised by like-minded countries. Mr. Speaker, the UN Convention makes it clear that the Corrupt Act is giving yourself undue advantage by making a payment to an official that ends up in that official's pocket. That's what the UN Convention says, and this legislation does not come up to the standard set out in the UN Convention, Mr. Speaker. Not only that, it's contrary to what the OECD requires of us, and the Minister mentioned the OECD and how these acts enhance compliance with the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, but actually we don't do what the OECD says we should be doing, because the OECD says we should not be making facilitation payments. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't come up to the standard of APEC. That's an organisation that we are a regular attendant at, and we come up to their standards in most effects, but APEC says that businesses should eliminate this practice, and we legislate specifically to allow it. APEC says eliminate it, OECD says eliminate it, and we legislate to allow it. The Serious Fraud Office and Business New Zealand run training programs to allow New Zealand businesses to operate in overseas countries without making facilitation payments, and both of those organisations recommend against facilitation payments, but this legislation explicitly allows them, sir. And I've mentioned the UN Convention Against Corruption. What really upsets me about this legislation is that there would not be a member in this House who is not proud of the fact that year after year, New Zealand is rated as one of the 2 least corrupt countries in the world. We deserve to be proud of that accolade. That accolade is given to us by Transparency International, but Transparency International railed against what we were doing in this legislation. And I want to quote the 4 key points that organisation makes. They make the first point, sir, that it would be illegal to make a facilitation payment to an official in New Zealand. So why is it not a double standard that the same business that would be committing a crime in New Zealand to make a facilitation payment to a customs official here is not committing a crime if they do it overseas? Secondly, they make the point that by allowing facilitation payments, that lets us perpetuate corrupt systems abroad. And I want to quote their submission. Paying these low-level bribes perpetuates a corrupt system, imposes additional costs on the host country's companies and citizens, and undermines efforts by the host country's government to stamp out corruption in their public service. But our legislation explicitly allows companies to do it. Thirdly, the Transparency International makes it clear that we are falling behind like-minded countries. The United Kingdom Bribery Act of 2010 prohibits facilitation payments. They don't make an exemption for it as our legislation does. They prohibit it. Canada has done the same thing. The United States and Australia are going in the same direction. We are the odd one out in that grouping of countries who would claim to be amongst the least corrupt countries in the world. And fourthly, Transparency International makes the point that you don't have to make facilitation payments to do business in these countries. And it quotes the 2009 business survey by Trace International that found that more than 3/4 of businesses said that with proper management, they did not have to go down the track of making facilitation payments, sir. An outright ban in this legislation would back up all of the organisations that have told us there is no place for facilitation payments. It would remove doubt. It would provide clear direction to businesses. But this government, in its weakness, has failed to put that provision in this legislation, which would otherwise be a perfectly good piece of legislation.